the radical right believes the communists act. In fact, this network, which we may identify as the round table groups, has no aversion to cooperating with the communists or any other groups, and frequently does so. I know of the operations of this network because I've studied it for 20 years. 20 years I studied it. And was permitted for 2 years in the early 1960s, to examine its papers and secret records. In the same book, Tragedy and Hope, he goes through the system and the Anglo-American establishment, his other book. He goes through this whole organization and how it is a parallel government. To be honest with you, it's really the real government, because every president and prime minister takes their orders from it. They advise all the top governments of the Western world. And they have the money to back it up, because the bankers are all in on it, as this book will tell you. It says here, going back into the last century again, because you must do it to understand what even happened in the 20th century. It says by 1915, round table groups existed in 7 countries. Now, they're still on the go. This is not old stuff. They're still working today, including England, South Africa, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, and a rather loosely organized group in the United States, which was comprised of George Louis Beer, Walter Lippmann, Frank Adelet, Whitney Shepperson, Thomas W. Lamont, Jerome D. Green, very interesting guy, Edwin D. Canham of the Christian Science Monitor, and others. The attitudes of the various groups were coordinated by frequent visits and discussions by a well-informed and totally anonymous quarterly magazine, The Round Table. Today, you can get Foreign Affairs magazine. That will tell you what's coming up in the world. It says here, the leaders of this group were Milner, that's Lord Alfred Milner, until his death in 1925, followed by Curtis, a very important person. He was like a Kissinger in his time, all over the planet. Robert H. Lord Brand, brother-in-law of Lady Astor. The Astors, by the way, were part of this group. And at the same time, they were funding and starting up the Fabian Society for what people think was the socialist movement. These were all lords and bankers and so on. Until his death in 1963, and now Adam D. Maris, son of Sir William and Brand's successor as managing director of Lazard Brothers Bank. That's who have helped fund them as well, Lazard Brothers. The original intention had been to have collegial leadership, but Milner was too secretive and headstrong to share the role. He did so only in the period 1913 to 1919, when he had regular meetings with some of his closer friends to coordinate activities as a pressure group in the struggle with Wilhelmine Germany. They also, what they used to do too, was train people right out from university. They'd pick them and choose the ones with most fervor that they could actually use as basically disciples, devotees. They called them the kindergarten. They still do it at university today. And as you well know, the CIA and MI6 recruit right out of there too. It's one and the same thing. Money from the widely ramified activities of this organization originally came from the associates and followers of Cecil Rhodes, chiefly from the Rhodes Trust itself, and from wealthy associates such as the Bate brothers from Sir Abe Bailey, and after 1915 from the Astor family. Since 1925, there have been substantial contributions from wealthy individuals, you better believe it, and from foundations and firms associated with international banking fraternity, especially the Carnegie United Kingdom Trust and other organizations associated with J.P. Morgan, the Rockefeller and Whitney families, and the associates of Lazard Brothers and of Morgan, Grenfell and Company. You should look into the Rees Commission, and I'll put a link up tonight where Norman Dodd talks about it when he was told face-to-face by some of these bankers. In fact, I think it was a Morgan Bank he was talking to, and they told him that the bankers had changed their role. They now become a form of institution because in society there were too many conflicting interests to be left up to sort of formulate themselves. Therefore, the banks would be a form of social control. Very interesting thing to say, because that's almost exactly what the Club of Rome said when they chose the collectivist idea. They said there were too many conflicting parties in the world for peace. And so they would choose collectivism. That's what's being pushed on us now, and that's what this President of the United States has been put in for. He won't do it. He's just an actor, like they all are. But he'll sign all the different treaties and so on that the U.S. has so far refused to sign. That's his job, to bring all of this in. It says the chief backbone of this organization grew up along the already existing financial cooperation running from the Morgan Bank in New York to a group of international financiers in London led by Lazard brothers. Milner himself in 1901 had refused a fabulous offer worth up to $100,000 a year, that was a lot of money then, to become one of the three partners of the Morgan Bank in London, in succession to the younger J.P. Morgan, who moved from London to join his father in New York. Eventually, the vacancy went to E.C. Grenfell, so the London affiliate of Morgan became known as Morgan, Grenfell and Company. Instead, Milner became director of a number of public banks, chiefly the London Joint Stock Bank, corporate precursor of the Midland Bank, transformed to the Midland Bank. He became one of the greatest political and financial powers in England, with his disciples strategically placed throughout England in significant places such as the editorship of The Times, The Observer, and managing director of Lazard Brothers. Quite the character, and it's still the same today. Back with more after this break. Hi folks, I am Alan Watt. We're cutting through the matrix, and it's safe to understand the present and where we're going very rapidly into this new future. You have to go into the past to understand that there truly is a massive organization worldwide that runs pretty well every side of every conflict, because conflict is a way to get to your goal. At the end of the conflicts, you have agreements, you have takeovers, you used to call them empire building, and we're going into the world empire. There's only a few countries to be flattened before it's complete. And those ones who get flattened are the ones they decided a long time ago couldn't fit in to this new economic, civilized society, as they put it themselves. I was reading about Milner, a very important person that helped set up part of this group, a big part of this group. And it says here, he became editor of The Times and of The Observer, managing director of Lazard Brothers as Banking International, various administrative posts, and even cabinet positions as politicians. There are politicians in every country. Ramifications were established in politics, high finance, Oxford and London universities, periodicals, that's magazines, the civil service, that's bureaucracy, and tax-exempt foundations. That was their method of transferring money, just as it was from the, because I say, the Cultural Cold War, also called Who Paid the Piper. And they still use the foundations today. There are thousands of them. And many of them are fronts and dummies that simply transfer money from one to the other. And they also are in the field of depopulating the planet, if you look to where the money is all going. At the end of World War I, 1914, it became clear that the organization of this system had to be greatly extended. Now, they had a plan to unite Europe. They had a plan to unite the Americas. In fact, in 2005, on the Canadian television, the CFR came out as the CFR with Mr. Manley, or Manning on it. I think it was Manley. And he'd been high up in politics in the Canadian federal government, and he spoke about having drafted up the agreements that the presidents and prime ministers were signing for the further integration of the Americas. So they drafted up all of that. And I bet you anything, too, because many of their members mentioned in this book were working on United Europe. They drafted up all of that as well. But they also had a far-ranging plan, a 100-years plan for the Far East, using Australia and New Zealand as their bases to bring all of that together. They were working in China and Japan. Remember what Karl Marx said? There'd be 3 major trading blocks under a world government. He said that in the 1800s as well. It says here, once again, the task was entrusted to Lionel Curtis to establish in England and each dominion, that's each part of the Commonwealth countries, a front organization. Remember what Cecil Rhodes said? They based their organization on the Jesuits.